Well, good day to everyone joining us and welcome to today's X-Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Optimizing Rare Disease Clinical Trials Through Patient Experience. My name is Ryan Muse and I'll be your X-Talks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes and this presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. Now, the webinar is designed to be interactive and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit your questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you require any assistance along the way, you can contact me at any time by sending a message using the same chat panel. At this time, know that all participants are in listen-only mode, and please note that the event will be recorded and made available for streaming on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank Scout Clinical, who developed the content for this presentation. Scout Clinical offers a comprehensive set of services in travel, expense reimbursement, and payment management to ease site burden and help patients participate in clinical trials. Scout ensures patient stipends, lodging, and travel are seamless anywhere in the world and has successfully moved people and managed payments in over 100 countries for nearly 1,000 studies. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's event. Pam Cusick, Senior Vice President at Rare Patient Voice, brings more than 30 years of experience in study design, implementation, and analysis. With educational credentials in psychology and past leadership roles in research foundations, she aims to expand RPV's panels and impact various disease categories. Monica Dudley-Weldon, the founder, president, and CEO of the SYNGAP1 Foundation, transformed her son Beckett's SYNGAP1 diagnosis into a mission for advocacy and support. In addition to leading the foundation, she's an author, public speaker, and legislative advocate with multiple advocacy awards to her name. And KimberLee Heidmann, co-founder of Scout Clinical, serves as the Executive Vice President of Patient Experience and the Global Head of Quality and Regulatory Affairs. Starting her career in life sciences in 1998, she's been instrumental in innovating Atlas Clinical Academy and focuses on making clinical research accessible to diverse populations. And so now, without further ado, I'd like to hand the mic over to our moderator for today's discussion, Kino Vanderpost. Kino joined Scout Clinical as Chief Revenue Officer in March 2023. He holds a PhD from the University of Liverpool in Environmental Change Research and has over 25 years life sciences industry experience in sales and marketing. Kino, you may begin when you're ready.
Thank you very much, Ryan. I'm very excited to be the moderator here today. Great topic. And we've got such a passionate panel here to interact with, so I'm really enjoying being really the question asker, and I'm sure I'm going to learn a lot today as well. So without further ado, let me just start with the first question. About 80% of clinical trials fail to finish on schedule. So perhaps if we can have a discussion around what are some of the reasons behind the high rate of clinical trial delays, particularly obviously in rare disease research. And maybe we can take that discussion just a little bit further and try and just extrapolate out how they differ from trials in the more common conditions. And maybe Pam, let's start with you.
Sure. Thanks for having me. So rare families, they experience a little bit different challenges than some other disease categories. First of all, there are fewer trials for rare families. As we know, the opportunity to participate is not quite the same as if you had asthma or diabetes. So some of the challenges, though, are getting your child or getting yourself to a particular site. We know that, I know people who have had to travel multiple times across the country, figuring out how to get their child in a wheelchair back and forth, from Boston to Stanford, multiple times a year. It's not easy to figure that out. And so at certain points, it's too much for families, and then they may choose not to continue for one reason or another. The other thing is, it's not always just that one child who has, that the need to be in a trial. they have multiple other children, they have a job, they have, other family members that they might be caring for. And so it's a little bit more, involved. And I'm not implying that other diseases are not also difficult. They are, but I think it's also a little bit challenging because people don't always understand rare disease. Even if you're working in a particular area, I know with SYNGAP, I didn't understand all the challenges with that condition. And so, if you're taking your child with SYNGAP from Texas to Baltimore to go to Kennedy Krieger, there's a lot you have to contend with. And we don't really think about those things. We're just thinking about, we want this person to be in the trial because they fit the criteria, but we're not always looking at the bigger picture. And so some of that can be handled prior to even when you're designing a trial. What makes sense? How can you make it easier for the families to stay in? And that would impact whether or not a trial was actually finished or finished on time.
Okay, thank you very much. Monica, over to you.
Oh goodness, this is a mouthful too for me. I think a lot of the reason, even clinical studies in our case, our kids' biggest issue is our population has a high diagnostic, symptom of autism and behavior issues. And we've had families that have expressed concerns of going to a site, of even traveling there, of afraid to put their child, say, on a plane. Mm-hmm. They're afraid to have their child in a car for so long, even if they travel, have to travel long distance. Also, not only that, let's say if they do attempt to get there, then they're worried about their child being able to tolerate it. And so it's just all of these unknown things that could happen. And when they're already, you already have tired parents, that's just like one more thing that they've got to consider. And it's like, oh, I'm so tired, I don't want to do it. It's that emotional drain. And I think that has, when we did our PFDD meeting, and we talked about this topic about, once we moved to these out of preclinical into clinical trials, talking about designing these trials, that we had to consider. Those are two of the things that stand out in my mind.
Okay. Yeah, I empathize with that. I have a child with autism, and I can understand that completely. KimberLee, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think, we talk about specifically the challenges that these families are encountering, and Monica touched on something really important, which was the collaboration in the design. So we really need to incorporate the patient voice, as Pam's group so nicely helps us do, and we need to work together as collaborators and be brought in early to discuss the trial design and the impact on the families so that they can actually complete and there's not a delay. So if we can anticipate these issues and design it such that we're not bringing families in tight timelines for assessments on a schedule of assessments that is so extended that you have a child that is, or an adult in some cases, that is unable to physically tolerate the demand of actually being in clinic and completing that visit, we have to address it at the outset and incorporate all of the knowledge that we have now gained by coming together in the research community as various collaborators coming in from advocacy groups, from third-party providers like Scout Clinical, from the sponsors, from the CROs, and really talking about how are we going to manage this, getting the clinician voice. The study coordinators know what's happening during these visits. Let's get that feedback and talk about that design to make it better for these families. And I think that would contribute and does contribute. And we've seen some great increase in the collaboration that's resulted positively.
Yeah, that's you actually hit on what was going to be my second question there. You hit on some of those other items, but perhaps let's take that just a little bit deeper. What do you think are some of the unique challenges faced, particularly by sponsors and CROs? And then maybe we can, if there's something we haven't covered yet with the patients with rare disease clinical trials. But I'm interested, KimberLee, in the sponsors and the CROs. for this one?
Yeah, I think, we already established that there's a foundational challenge of actually finding the patients, making sure that they meet the criteria for the study. In many cases, there are rare disease families who've been looking for a diagnosis for years. They didn't know that this was the disease that they had, and some feel abandoned by the healthcare system when they finally do get a diagnosis. Then they say, well, I didn't know, and there was no one to help me. And then you get the diagnosis, but then they don't know about the research because perhaps their physician in that hospital doesn't know that this research is going on. So I think there's a challenge for the sponsors and the CROs in finding these patients, and we've got to leverage the network of advocacy groups and start talking to general clinicians, general physicians, and educating them on the rare diseases, because there are a lot of physicians that specifically, here in Dallas, we have UT Southwestern. They have fantastic research going on certain diseases that you could go to a pulmonologist down the road. They haven't even heard that could be a potential for their patient. So they're not identifying that patient and then sending them to the research facility. So I think that is definitely a challenge. It's a foundational challenge, but it's certainly something that we can and are trying to address.
Pam, what do you think about that? With reference to Kimberlee's point about the sponsors, the CROs needing to engage with the advocacy groups.
So that's very important. One of the things that we found out we did some research in our community of patients and caregivers, and where patients want to learn about clinical trials is from their doctors. So to Kimberlee's point, they don't, that's who they trust. And so if that doctor is not connected to a research hospital, if they're not up on the research in that area, and again, if in a rare disease, one, they might not even know about the disease, and then trying to find that trial, that's another whole problem. So it's it's a matter of trust and understanding, where those patients want to get that information, and then funneling the information to the doctor so they can share that. Advocacy groups are phenomenal, and we work with so many of them to help identify patients who want to participate in research through Rare Patient Voice. Again, through prior research that we did a couple years ago, you would think that all patients knew about advocacy groups, that, if they were diagnosed with something in particular, that's the first thing they would look at. No, they don't know. So about half of the patients, again, in about a 2,000 person study, about half of the patients said they don't work with an advocacy group, nor do they even know about one for their disease area, which is, in our world is sort of mind blowing, because we think, who would not go to an advocacy group? But, every person doesn't really know that that's a thing, that's something that they could go to get information, or they could go to find resources. They're just trusting their doctor. If you're a parent, you're trusting the pediatrician. If you're, an older person, like my parents would trust their doctor to tell them whatever it was that, that was important for them, and not necessarily go on Google and see what sort of advocacy groups are out there. Again, advocacy groups are very important for the people who are part of those groups. It's really, really useful to, to be supported by a network that understands your disease area. But that doesn't capture everybody. And so when we're talking about trying to expand how we find people for clinical trials, and to cast a wider net, and part of that is finding a way to get to the doctors who the patients trust.
So, Monica, over to you. Your thoughts.
Well, I have to echo both what Kimberlee and Pam said, and to add to that is there's a lot of inequity. When we're talking about rare diseases, they're spread out everywhere. For instance, I'm from Texas, and we have a pretty decent population of patients in Texas. But you've got one that lives way out in Waxahachie, right? And then you've got one that lives way in McAllen, right? But also these rural places, and then on top of that, even those people that are in rural settings, it's hard for them to get a diagnosis. It's hard for them to get to these major medical centers. And then the access, genetic testing. We know that these kids are out there. And like myself, Beckett was the sixth one diagnosed with a SYNGAP1 mutation in 2012. And I happened to be, had the ability, I had to jump through hoops. I had insurance at the time. However, even though the exome was not covered on insurance, and so it was in a research basis then. But I still had the resources to go and take out a loan for $13,000 to go get the testing done. And of course, that's not something that a lot of people can do. And another point is, and because I come from the education field, I taught school for 23 years, and you have a wide and diverse people learn at in different ways. And so their education and exposure to things that other people have, they just might not comprehend or even know to go look, like you're saying with the advocacy groups. And so you have to meet people where they are, right? And you have to figure out, for instance, in Edinburgh, during COVID, we were trying to think of some different ways of how to meet the challenge. Now, UK is very small in comparison to, say, Texas. I think you could fit UK and Texas, but they were so close together. I don't know. Well, I don't know geography, but you get these people and they're in close proximity. So we did a mobile van, right, where the team went to the home of the child and did all the assessments there in their natural environment. And that's one of the ways we ended up getting some of the data. But I'm just throwing that out there, and you're just wondering, how could you incorporate that into clinical trials? What would that look like? So I'll just leave you guys with that.
Yeah. Thanks very much for that, Monica. Okay, Ryan, why don't we go to our first polling question?
Yes, so appearing on everyone's screen right now is a polling question, and you can participate by selecting on any of the answers you see in front of you and then clicking submit. The question that we're asking is, in your experience, what is the most significant challenge to researching and developing rare disease treatments? Your answer options are accurate diagnosis and trial participant identification, optimizing patient experience and support, overcoming regulatory hurdles, scaling treatments for small patient populations, or balancing cost effectiveness and innovation. We'll give everyone some time to consider their answer as it best applies to yourself, and please select one and participate to the question again of, in your experience, what is the most significant challenge to researching and developing rare disease treatments? Looks like most of you have submitted an answer, so thank you so much for participating. Let's look at your results here. We have 54% for accurate diagnosis, 18% for balancing cost effectiveness and innovation, 14% of you selecting optimizing patient experience, and then 7% both for overcoming regulatory hurdles and scaling treatments. So again, thank you for participating. Kino, it's back to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ryan. That's interesting, isn't it? Accurate diagnosis and trial participant identification. Interesting. Okay. All right. So let's take on some more questions for our panel here. Let's look a little bit at the patient experience, because I think we've kind of alluded to that. So we're kind of in the zone of this here. So if we consider then the challenges of rare disease clinical trials, what's your respective opinions as to how researchers can provide more meaningful incentives to encourage patient participation? And perhaps just setting that in the context that there's still obviously a need to respect the patient's quality of life and well-being. So Monica, let's go to you.
Okay, well, an incentive, I would have to say, well, I like Pam's method. Is when if you take a survey, you're going to get a little something, right? I mean, whether it be an Amazon gift card or For instance, our organization, supported a GATE study at Texas Children's, and we're still recruiting for that particular research study. And I didn't know this, but they were giving $75 gift cards, to the families just to participate, and it was only a couple of hours. Now, granted, I was in driving distance, but still, that's something. It would pay for the gas. It would pay for whatever lunch, or it would take some of that extra burden off, financial burden off the families. And I think, well, it's like dangling a carrot. We try to provide as an organization travel stipends so that it will at least cover the travel, or even a night in a hotel. An accommodation in a hotel. And that really makes a difference, because you've got so many wide ranges of incomes, right? You've got two parents working a job. Some of them work 2 and 3 jobs. Single parents, right? You've got that whole dynamic there. But for me, say I'm a single mom, to bring Beckett in a plane to Baltimore from Houston, that would be scary for me. But I think closer, bringing, like I said, the research to you, or to the patient and the caregiver, it would be a much, dangling a carrot. So that's my 2 cents.
Thanks, Monica. Pam, what are your thoughts?
I think making it easy for the patients is important. Make it easy for the caregivers to bring their patients, if it's their mom or dad or grandparents. Every little thing you can do to support a patient or support a family, to help them to get to a trial, to help them want to stay in a trial, is going to make it easier for the sponsor, but easier for the family. And I think some of those things, as Monica said, supporting people financially is one thing, which is a really nice thing, and we do that with patients in our community when they participate in a study. But in clinical trials, there are other rules about compensation in some ways. So there are other ways to to support patients, again, helping them figure out their travel, bringing the research to them, helping support their families, where, I might have, a dog and 3 other kids, and, other things that I have to do in order to, to get my child to a site. It's important to make sure that I'm thinking about that as I design a study. The other thing, in terms of, when you're in that kind of study design phase, you think about what you really need versus what's a nice to have. So the example which I had, heard about from somebody some time ago was, a study where they wanted to do with a child to do about 12 sticks in a visit to, get, different blood draws and so on. And unfortunately, it was in the protocol design phase where they were talking to, getting patient input, and they said, no, my child, they're never coming back. If you're going to do that in one visit, they're never going to want to come back. And so they went back to the sites and said, are these things need, or are these things that are just nice to have in case you might need something later? And it was, in fact, it was the nice to have. And so they went back and, what do we actually need for this visit? And that was, pared down and made it easier for the family to be able to, engage their child and bring them there, and then not scare them off to come back again. And another example where, a woman who I know was in various phases of a trial over 12 years, and she went back and forth to this site, flew to this site multiple times a year. Well, all they were doing was a basic medical history, verbal, and then collecting a few, like a blood draw and some other vitals over 12 years, multiple times a year. Now, could that have been done at her local hospital? Could someone have come from that site and gone to, her house? I don't know. I mean, maybe 12 years ago, no one was thinking about that. But now today you can think about those things, and how do you make that better so that, I mean, she stayed in it because it's a genetic disorder that if impacts, her, impacted her parents, herself, her kids, and she wants to try to, find an end to it. So she's, stayed in it. But the thing is, she is unique, I think. I don't know that I would have gone for 12 years back and forth. But the thing that kind of made me sad about it, she said, I'm thinking about all the time I could have spent with my son, who is now in high school getting ready to, go off to college. And that's important. So as you're designing a trial, as you're thinking about what do we really need, how could you make that better for the patient, for their life, for their family, so that they would want to stay in? Because I guarantee you, she is unique among patients. Not everyone is going to want to do something like that. So I think there are a lot of ways that you can proactively think about how you can support a family, how you can support a patient to make the experience, better for them, so they'll want to stay in the trial. Again, back to the 12 stick, I would not bring my child back, I'm sure, because they'd be so upset after the first time, and as a parent, you feel guilty about literally everything that happens, right? Because that's your fault, right?
We
Well, that's,
we call that white coat syndrome.
there you go.
So when things like that happen, when they see a doctor in a white coat, they're terrified. So
Right.
yeah,
I think it's again.
It's a repeat
Well, and I
performance.
think
You know what's coming. Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
and I think that following on to what Pam's talking about, what we're addressing here with the design and thinking about the patient and making it easier for them. But when we actually bring the potential of a trial to a candidate, to a potential patient and their care circle, their family, their friends, whoever are involved and are going to be chiming in on whether or not they should participate or put their child in, because that's the other thing, as families, we're going to get input, right? We're going to look for wise counsel around us. Should I put my husband, my wife, my child, should they be a part of this trial? What follows on from that is education. We can't just build the trials so that they are patient friendly and they work for the families. We have to let the families know that. Look, we've done this work. We've looked into how we can best accommodate your needs. We understand that there are going to be certain very challenging aspects of participating in this trial. And here's everything that we've done to make this easier for you. Because if you don't educate them, until COVID, there was, being in this industry, we've all been in this industry, everybody on this call, for a very long time, for multiple decades. And before COVID, I felt like no one really understood what we did. And they didn't, clinical research, what is that, right? And COVID made clinical research more accessible, but it also didn't really give the good education. People get their snippets from the news. They understand very small things, and maybe their exposure is only to vaccine trials. So we need to make sure that we're educating these families, because a lot of times there's a fear. And, when you say, how can we enhance potential participation? First of all, a lot of rare disease families participate in trials because it's hope. It's an opportunity. It's something, right, where we potentially don't have hope somewhere else. And so educating them on the good things that have been done to make the trial simpler would be a huge enhancement. And I think a major recruitment tool to help ease the minds of the families.
I don't think people even think of that. It's a really wonderful idea, because there is a lot that goes on, and I'm sure, sponsors, sites think about those things, as ways to increase, recruitment and retention. But, you forget to share the things that you did, in order to make it easier. So that is a really important point.
Okay, great discussion. Let's take a quick pause here. Ryan, let's go to our second set of questions, please.
Yes, thank you. So appearing on everyone's screen is another polling question. This time what we're asking is, in your opinion, what is the most critical aspect of ensuring positive patient experience in rare disease clinical trials? Your answer options are timely and transparent communication, access to patient advocacy group support and resources, streamlined patient-friendly trial protocols, inclusion of patient-reported outcomes, or personalized patient care plans. As with the previous poll, please take a moment to think about one of your answers, select it, and then click Submit to participate. Again, we're asking the question of, in your opinion, what is the most critical aspect of ensuring positive patient experience in rare disease clinical trials? Give everyone a few more seconds to consider your answer, and then we'll take a look at our results. Looks like most of you have participated, so thank you so much. Here we are with our results. Here we have 48% of you selecting streamlined, patient-friendly trial protocols, 29% for timely and transparent communication, 13% for access to patient advocacy groups, 6% personalized patient care plans, and then 3% of you selecting inclusion of patient-reported outcomes. So thank you again for your participation. Kino, I hand it back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. Yeah, the timely and transparent communication, certainly in discussions I've been having recently, that's a key topic. So glad to see that got borne out in the answers there. Okay, I'm quite keen here just to carry on a little bit down this vein, and maybe we can just ask ourselves the question here: how does the patient experience actually impact the overall success of a rare disease clinical trial? KimberLee, let's start with you.
Well, I think the simple answer is a poor experience means you don't complete the trial. You don't get your outcomes, you don't get your data, and we don't move forward. I think looking beyond that is we need to look at what is the non-completion of a trial or the lack of moving forward with a trial, and therefore the innovation that comes from that and the treatment, what impact does that have on global health? I think that's what we need to look at. What impact does that have on generations to come? So Pam mentioned earlier about the woman that participated in the trial because she had a genetic condition, a genetic disease. There are many genetic diseases that impact adults that there is no curative therapy for. And these adults know that their children potentially carry and have these telomeres, have these, specific aspects of this genetic condition that is going to impact them, say, in 30 years. And in 30 years' time, we've seen almost no research, right? We've seen, if you look to the past, we haven't seen that much. So we need to think about not only in terms of what does the patient experience have to do for trials today and the trials we're trying to complete, but what is the delay in those trials and that therapy potentially have on future generations? And I think if we think about that, we will be that's where a lot of our passion comes from, to make the trials accessible. Monica talked about these rural communities, and I'm a Texas girl myself, so we share that in common. I was raised in small town Texas, 2.5 hours from the closest major hospital. If there were people in that community that needed this type of treatment, the local doctor would not have been able to provide that. And many of those people did not have the resources. There are no taxis. There are no, that's not a possibility. So the experience for them has to be one, like Pam said, where we're making it simpler for them. And we're actually facilitating that to move them where they need to be, to give them the resources so that we don't contribute to these delays. So, what impact does the patient experience have? Well, foundationally, it can shut down your trial if you don't get the patients and you don't get the outcomes and you don't get the data. But ultimately, it's going to impact future generations and the health of our world and the people all over the world. We're doing research. We talk about diversity and equity in clinical research. Bringing that research to those more diverse populations, we need to see how drug affects patients in rural areas versus patients in urban areas, patients of certain genders, patients in various socioeconomic environments or in various countries that are impacted differently in order to make sure that we're getting the appropriate treatment out to the world. So I think it's not just about the trial, but it's about the future impact too.
Let's just take this a bit forward then. So clearly there is a need for greater consideration. We have to think clearly about the designs of the studies that we're wanting to conduct here. Pam, can you just give us an idea? How can researchers perhaps establish a better and maybe a more effective partnership with the rare disease community? And obviously, advocacy groups like yours. And let's look at this in the context of why perhaps this is going to be a key cornerstone to a clinical trial success.
Yeah, so the most important thing is asking patients what they think. And so there are, we have done in 10 years, thousands and thousands, almost 9,000 different studies, various parts of different projects and bringing products to market. But, some of those studies that we're working on are asking patients, asking caregivers, what they want, what their experience has been in order to make things better. So I think the most important thing is to, as you're designing something, whether it's a clinical trial, it's a device, it's a something, ask patients. You have to get their input. And I think, for so long we have relied on what doctors think or, what experts think, right? So, well, or we did this before, right? This is how we did this study last time. Now we're going to do it again. But you're not necessarily getting the input from the people who are impacted on the ground. So I think the most important thing is to go out to a patient community. You could go to an advocacy group, of course. You could come to, Rare Patient Voice, where, we connect patients and caregivers with all types of research, and, find those, that unique group that you're looking for, and find out what their needs are. What are their, what would make life easier for them? How could we support them in a way to make their experience better? And that's, for clinical trials, for all sorts of, development of products and services, you would probably not be surprised how often, I hear about a really great device that some brilliant mind has come up with, or a website or an app. But then you ask, well, have you thought about testing that with the patients who you're wanting to deliver that to? And they're like, wow, that's a great idea. Like, wow, I should have had a V8. But it's so important to get their input. And so I think working with organizations like Rare Patient Voice, working with specific advocacy groups that that are in the disease area that you're focused on, get to know them, get to know those patients and understand what their pain points are, understand what their needs are, because that will help in so many ways to develop trials, products, services, whatever it is that you as an end client is doing. It's going to help you to develop something that is much more useful and beneficial to that community. And, like Monica's community, it touches so many other communities. So it touches, the autism community. I think epilepsy, there's so many other communities that are impacted by some of these rare conditions, that you can make life better for so many people by finding out what those people need.
For whatever the reasons are that they're not doing that really as well as they could be doing today. And just thinking to the poll we just ran there, Monica, maybe you could elaborate a bit on the importance of that transparency and perhaps some of the honesty regarding participating in a rare disease clinical trial, and maybe also the honesty and the transparency around some of the risks as well as the benefits.
Well, I think families want to know what they're going to get out of it. One of the things that we also talked about in our PFDD meeting was, what is our threshold? I mean, what is our non-negotiable? What will we not do when it comes even to procedures, right? Are we going to put our child under anesthesia to go have an MRI done or a CAT scan, where they're not going to sit still in a little tube, right? I mean, these are kind of things that families think about. What are the risks? I mean, it's kind of like you got to take the lesser of two evils, right? And so having that explained to them in a way, that is, it's not complicated to where it looks like smoke and mirrors. You know what I'm saying? where it's going to lead our families' minds are just everywhere. So I think that, well, this is a teacher coming out of me again. When a child is struggling to understand, you bring them to a tutorial, or you spend that extra time with them, because knowledge is power, right? So education and letting these families know exactly. It's not just running, hey, here's a consent and sign it, right? Because it is one of those things where you need to be able to go through these things, even though it's going to take some time, but that time to go through it may just pay off, in the end, right? I mean, so you have to invest in these types of things, and it's an investment. I mean, you're putting millions of dollars. But I think the one thing that companies need to think about is the investment in time, because a lot of these families go, well, they didn't listen to me. I only went in there 15 minutes. And I'm not talking about physicians and clinicians or researchers, but I think, well, and also there's a compliance issue, right? Patient organizations and I think leaders don't understand the compliance boundaries between the sponsor of a drug and what they can do. So we have to be very careful about how we engage, and that's another challenge. And I don't mean to go on about it, but I think it's a very delicate gray line, and I do think spending the time to educate these families, you're going to get more buy-in, because they're not going to take away the fear.
Okay, let's just take a brief pause there. Ryan, could we have our final polling question, please?
Yes, we can. Once more, appearing on everyone's screen is our next poll question. Please select one of the answers to participate and click submit. The question we're asking here is, how can we best enhance patients' motivation to participate? Your answer options are enhanced communication with providers, provide trial educational materials for patients and caregivers, convenient transportation and reimbursement and cost neutrality for participation, flexible scheduling of study visits, or stronger community support. In a moment, we'll be getting into a Q&A session with our wonderful speakers, but for now, please take a moment to participate in this poll to answer the question again of how can we best enhance patients' motivation to participate? Looks like most of you have an answer in, so thank you so much for participating. Let's look at your results here. We have 54% of you for transport and reimbursement cost neutrality, 21% for flexible scheduling of visits, 18% for providing trial educational materials, and then 4% both for stronger community support and enhanced communication with providers. So thank you once more for your participation in this poll, and Kino, it's back to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Ryan. So we do want to save a little bit of time for Q&A, but I just wanted to ask this final question with, hopefully some, if we can answer briefly. What do we think are the major challenges that still need to be addressed in rare disease clinical research? And are there any key questions that remain unanswered? Monica.
Oh my goodness. I think the number of trial sites. The number of trial sites is important, and when you have rare disease, you're going to have few trial sites and few experts.
Right. Pam.
So my short of answer.
I would say educating physicians about trials and getting that information out to them, because those are the trusted entities. Those are the people who your patients, your caregivers trust their pediatrician, their doctor. And so if that doctor says, hey, look into this trial, you're much more likely to find some buy-in there.
Great points. KimberLee.
Yeah, obviously very much agree with those two things. And I think that they also work together with, I was intrigued by the answers to the last polling question and the number of people who indicated the cost neutrality as being the top answer. And I would say that with the limited ability to increase the number of trial sites, which Monica's exactly right. There have to be the experts in order to have the centers for excellence. There have to be the experts in those places. That we also have to make sure rare disease, supporting cost neutrality in rare disease studies for rare disease families often includes cross-border enrollment. It often includes quite extensive logistical support to make sure that the families can complete the visits that are generally over multiple days. Like we said, sponsors that are more forward thinking, that are being very proactive in trial design, are trying to break these long visits into shorter visits, really looking at the needs instead of the wants, like Pam was saying. What are we doing in the assessment? And so in order to do that, we really have to make sure that we're not just, we're looking at the cost, right? And the sponsors are looking at the cost, and the pass-through expenses for logistic support and cost neutrality in rare disease. If you look at that, they're much higher than in your more common diseases, because we're pulling patients from farther away who have much more extensive travel and accommodation needs. You know, Monica was talking, we were chatting earlier before the call about parking in cities. Well, imagine if you're parking at a massive hospital complex with a child or a parent or a care partner, you know, someone in your family that is not ambulatory and has all of this equipment. How are you doing that? If you're pulling up in an accessible van, where do you park, right? So we have to think about those things, and those pass-through expenses, those expenses are quite high. And so we really need to talk about that. We need to talk about the expense in terms of how much we're spending on clinical trials in the whole. Keeping that patient, even though those pass-through expenses are higher than they might be in other diseases, that patient may be an N of very few, right? You've got this very small number of patients. I would love to see us continue this discussion to talk about how valuable it is to really evaluate the cost benefit on this and really see the sponsors adopt. And we're seeing that more and more with the various patient groups inside the sponsors really talking about this.
Yeah, thanks, Kimberly. Yeah, you know, so much of the discussion these days is around zero barriers to inclusion. And it's just very apparent when you're looking at rare diseases that there are more barriers than there are with other therapeutic indications. And hopefully we've been able to offer some insight here in today's webinar. Ryan, I'm observant of the fact I'd like to have chance for to take on some questions for the panelists here from the floor.
Yes, so thank you everyone very much for that very insightful discussion. At this point, I'd like to invite the audience to keep sending their questions or comments right now for our Q&A portion of the webinar. Also, I'd like to draw their attention towards the handouts module within the GoToWebinar control panel, where you'll find some additional documentation related to today's presentation to download for some further reading. Now, I've already received some questions from the audience, though, so we'll get ourselves started with those. The very first question that I have here, and I think this probably is best directed towards Kimberly, what they'd like to know is, have you encountered challenges with regulatory in trying to provide stipends, gift cards, etc.?
Yeah, it's a really excellent topic to discuss because of the regulatory impact and the regulatory landscape that we've had in clinical research for some time. You know, we really, with ICH GCP, we're trying to make sure that we have that balance between giving the patients what they need. And, you know, when you're talking to an IRB or an EC, we don't want anything that's going to look like we're trying to induce the patient or the family to participate. So there is a very significant balance. And Monica brought this up earlier about the relationship between the sponsors and the patients and what can we actually do. Now, one of the positives that we've seen over the last few years is that in the regulatory landscape, we're seeing a lot more of an adoption towards the IRBs and ECs, understanding that this is just to actually facilitate the participation and remove undue burden. We're not trying to give an added benefit, right? An additional, which would not be acceptable. What we're trying to do is establish the baseline for what the burden is and then approach that. We have had some challenges And there are challenges. You often have to make sure that you are doing adequate research on what you can and cannot provide, whether you're using a local IRB or EC or you're using central, and what is tolerable. And I like that we're seeing a lot more, specifically with some of the central IRBs, we're seeing a lot more discussion around what is possible and a lot more eyes opening up to the actual burden. We had some countries, during COVID that were previously very strict on what could be provided for patients, that really started to broaden what they were allowing from a regulatory standpoint because of what Monica was talking earlier about. We couldn't get the patients to the clinic, or we couldn't do that. So they had to recognize that significant burden. So we have seen some positive movement in the regulatory field. I personally feel like there's still a ways to go, that we need to make sure that we're actually having the conversation and being realistic about the burden so that we're not seeing that as inducement. Facilitating, making sure that a patient has an offset and a cost neutrality to participate, and they're not actually, having to go into debt or take out a loan or do these things just to participate. That's not inducement. That's just making sure that we're all working together in the clinical trial space and recognizing the families for what they are, which is the most significant participant in the clinical trial process. So yes, definitely have we seen that, but I see some valuable progress.
Very good. Very interesting. Thank you for sharing that with us. The next question is probably directed towards Pam. I think what they'd like to know is, how do you determine which physicians to prioritize when many rare families see so many specialists for care?
Interesting question. I don't really have a great answer for that. I think it's, in my mind, and again, going back to the research that that I shared earlier, it's individuals, not the research hospitals physicians, it's their hometown physicians. So as KimberLee was saying, the small town physician in her community is that first point of care, and those are the people who the patients and caregivers trust. So I think it's not a matter of priority necessarily. It is general education for all primary care physicians, that they have access somehow to, to clinical trials. I know everyone can look up clinicaltrials.gov, but, it's, having an easier way to do that, try to figure out how you can get that to doctors, because if I'm in a small town and I've always been at that same doctor, and now I'm diagnosed with something that I don't know about, that's the only person I'm going to trust. And if, and so that person is the person who personally I would want them to tell me, hey, here are these 5 trials, that could be for your condition. And I should go check them out. And that may send me to another doctor, which is a whole nother, level of challenge, but at least that person who I trust is the one who gave me the information. And that's, I think that's that it's not priority necessarily, but it's expanding the understanding of the availability of clinical trials. And I think, to KimberLee's point earlier, people didn't really understand what a clinical trial was prior to COVID necessarily, and they've heard the word more now. I think now it's more important than ever to normalize it, so that, your doctor who you see in small town Texas says, hey, and you know what, and there is no treatment for this, but there are some trials going on, let's look into these things. And I think that's, I don't know that I answered the question exactly, but in my heart, I think that's what, needs to be done. People need to have better understanding and access of the, the fact that there are clinical trials out there, and share that with their patients.
That's great. Thank you very much for that insight. Another question here is simply just wondering if transportation to clinical trials is a barrier to participation.
Oh, for sure. I mean, just from people that, who we've talked to, about their experiences getting to a trial. The family that I mentioned before, traveling back and forth multiple times from Boston to Stanford, and back and forth and back and forth. with a wheelchair, figuring out, okay, now my flight's been delayed. Now I need to get to a hospital, but I can't take an Uber because I need an Uber that's, that's accessible. There's so many challenges just within that one trip, right? And transportation with a wheelchair is one level of challenge, but transportation with a medically fragile child, whatever, their challenge is, be it behavioral or physical or both, that difficulty of getting a patient to and from a site is significant and will stop people from participating. So if you can make that easier for them, if you can make it, make it a less scary, experience. So let's say I get from, to the airport, because somebody drops me off and now I'm on the plane and I've gotten that far, have someone come pick me up at the hospital and bring, or at the airport, and bring, me and my, my parent, my child, my care partner, and bring me to the site and make it easier, make it seamless. Because that is truly, one of the biggest, the cost of it is huge, is a whole nother barrier. But physically getting from place to place is a huge challenge. So I think that's, it's a yes with all that behind it.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I'm sorry.
Yeah, Ryan, I'd be keen to hear Monica's thoughts on that question as well.
Yes. Well, it's not just financial. Well, it is the behaviors, but we did bring Beckett in a plane to Baltimore from Houston, but it took 2 of us. So that's 3 airline tickets, and round trip, and then we did it. We got there, and we had to ride a few escalators up and down for a while, because they have this addiction. But honestly, we weighed the cost, the pros and the cons, the cost versus, the benefit. And we were like, we got to at least try this once, but I wasn't going to try it by myself. So I think those are things that you have to take into consideration. I mean, and some people can't afford to take, to take out, airline tickets. I mean, it's expensive. Well, it's definitely expensive now, but yeah, we've even considered train, where there's accessible to like an Amtrak, because for our kids, they love that motion. And so some of our families have considered that, which is a little less expensive than an airline ticket.
Very good.
Probably easier to come on.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, so thank you, both of you, for that answer, and all of you for all of your time here today. But we have reached the end of the Q&A portion for the webinar. If we couldn't attend to your questions, though, know that the team at Scout Clinical will follow up with you. Or if you have further questions, you can direct them to the email addresses that are up on the screen. I want to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email from X-Talks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen as you exit, and your participation is appreciated as it helps us to improve our webinars. Now, also, there's a link in the chat box, and with this link, you'll be able to view the recording of this event, which you can also share with your colleagues so they may register for the recording here as well. Now, please join me once more in thanking our speakers for their wonderful time here today. We hope you all found the webinar informative. Have a great day, everyone, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye now.